My guest this segment is my friend and honored colleague, Peter Joseph. He's an American musician, filmmaker, author, and activist. In 2009, he founded the Zeitgeist movement, a global nonprofit sustainability advocacy group, and has been on the advisory board and steering committee for Project Peace on Earth since 2013. He's also the creator of the Culture in Decline web series, and his newest book is called The New Human Rights Movement. Peter, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you're here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Marianne. I appreciate you having me.
You know, Peter, when the Zeitgeist films came out, it was a huge moment. It sort of brought together information and feelings that so many people were having, but we weren't quite naming yet. It was a profound cultural explosion when those films came out. Now, in many ways, the culture seems to have caught up with you, and a large part of the conversation that you were having with the Zeitgeist films is now part of mainstream dialogue. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have an economic system that clearly is not working for the majority of people, both here in the United States and around the world. So, once again, you having been in this conversation for so long, what was the first sign in your life that something was deeply askew with America's economic system and that we needed to be having a very different conversation?
I think that would probably go back to my childhood, having grown up with my parents as civil servants, particularly my mother working in child protective services in deep rural North Carolina, which is subject, as you might imagine, to great deprivation and then great trauma and abuse, particularly in families and generations of child abuse and things of that nature. And I was in that, there's a peripheral kind of a sensation there. Obviously, as a young kid, I'm not thinking about changing the world, but I was around that subject matter, and it kind of stuck inside my craw and the back of my subconscious as I grew older and went through the general kind of narcissism through your teenage and 20s. And then I sort of just had this kind of awakening, I suppose you could call it that, when I produced the very first Zeitgeist film, which was never supposed to be released. It was actually a performance piece that was done simply for my own amusement, so to speak, or I should say catharsis, in my own kind of subconscious frustration, which is where I allocate it. At that time, I was working in Wall Street-related things and in an advertising agency, two of, as far as I'm concerned, the most useless institutions on the face of the earth. But that's for another conversation. So
no, it's not. It's very much for this conversation, but go on.
Well, so I not to jump too far ahead, but I attribute a lot of my social activism and drive to my mother's work because as I reflected on what she did for a living for 20, 30 years, I realized just how important the economy actually was. You really can't stop the generations of child abuse and then the neurotic problems that happen with people as they age unless you stop the vast inequality that, as far as I'm concerned, and we can get into, is built into the structure of capitalism, if you want to call it that, though I think we could use other words for it. And again, we can expand upon that. So inequality and deprivation and poverty all intermix to create a very, very toxic environment. And I think that, to shortly answer the question, is sort of where it all began.
So you began to realize, and first of all, when you say that you weren't even planning on releasing the film, it was just a performance art piece of your own. You must have been so blown away when this moment came when it's all any of us could talk about. That must have been really mind-blowing for you, yes?
Well, yeah, kind of strange serendipity. I never intended to pursue any kind of social work in my life. It kind of happened, and I realized that there was an audience for this kind of subject matter and this kind of thinking, and it kind of took on a life of its own. I feel like I've been pushed in what I've been doing. I don't sit around and think about what my next step is. I just kind of listen to my environment, and over the past 10 years, I've just sort of been guided for better or for worse. I have to admit, it can be very stressful. You're getting thousands of emails and people that are trying to figure out what to do for the future. And obviously we are in a deeply critical period in terms of environmental sustainability and social sustainability by extension. The exponential increase in socioeconomic inequality in concert with the ecological decline is one of the most unprecedented problems we face in synergy of the entire human species. We have never in the history of our adaptations experienced a decline in our access to resources in the sense of loss of biodiversity, resource overshoot. This is the first in the history of our entire species, and we don't know what to do. And back to my core kind of thesis at this point as an activist, excuse me, until we have system level change, until we see the economy change, we're not going to be able to rectify the vast majority of the problems that keep mounting.
So you began to realize that it wasn't just a matter of a person having economic difficulties over here and a person having economic difficulties over there. You began to realize it was a systemic problem built into the economics that we were practicing as a society. You realized that millions of people were trapped within this system, and you basically foresaw some of the more devastating results of the decline that would occur because this has been going on for so many decades. One of the things that you said just now is that you think there could be a better word for it than capitalism. And I'm curious about your saying that, because I do think there's a simplistic conversation going on, and we need to go much deeper and far more nuanced.
Yes.
Some people say, we just got to end capitalism. Well, it's not quite that simple. So I'd love for you to lay out for us, first of all, your issues with that particular word. What is the actual problem? Is that the best word to use? And what's possible now? Is radical transformation possible? And much along the line of what you were just saying, is it possible in time?
Okay. So the issue of the term capitalism is there's fundamentally two problems. One of it's rooted in language, hence the semantic problem, because you'll find if you walk down the street and ask everybody what capitalism is, you're going to get many different definitions. It's sort of like a building, a structure. You look at it from different angles and people have different interpretations of it. I'd like to tell a little story about that because it helps frame the way to think about this. 12,000 years ago, we evolved from hunter-gatherer societies that had no agricultural ability. They lived in complete harmony with nature because they could not affect nature. Upon the Neolithic Revolution, the Anthropocene era, this is when we, past 12,000 years, where we are able to actually affect the planet. We could put our hands in the soil. We started to develop technology. It seemed very great at the beginning, and a lot of anthropologists will actually admit that it was probably the greatest mistake we ever made, even though that's very hard for us to think about in the primitive association we have to those early indigenous cultures. But actually, I would actually argue as an aside, they were far more advanced because they didn't have the ability to destroy themselves as we've created now. But so 12,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution happened. We discover agriculture, and suddenly everything changes. Suddenly you have settled societies. Suddenly you have pockets of societies in a very unbalanced world. Some societies are near water. Some are near desert regions. So you're trying to navigate now civilization from a position of imbalance inherently because of the settled nature. And what does that create? It creates an incentive to start to trade, specialization of labor. Someone grows some corn, I'm going to make some shoes. Suddenly there's an incentive and a natural propensity to start trading. So you trade with each other, everyone utilizes their specialized ability. Suddenly communities start to trade with each other, and these networks of markets build out. And they've gone through many different permutations. You can talk about feudalism and the differences between, say, capitalism, socialism, feudalism, mercantilism, and all those isms. Underneath all of those is still a fundamental premise of specialized labor and trade, which has inside of it certain implications. You have to have property. You have to have a competitive dynamic. You have to have an exploitative dynamic. And I don't mean that necessarily in a cruel sense where you're hitting slaves with whips. The entire premise of market behavior is based upon some form of advantage through exploitation. It's one of the most fundamental principles that seems to be misunderstood because it's not about a value system. It's just what you do. If I'm going to hire someone to work for me and I'm on a serious budget, I'm not going to hire the person that I have to pay the most money to if I can find someone equivalent that has some degree of deficiency and I can pay them less. We hate to admit that, but that is the fundamental gaming mentality of the system we've created. So property, dominance, exploitation, competition. This is what I call in my book the root socioeconomic orientation of our society, which was born out of the Neolithic Revolution and is carried forward with us to this day. That is the framework and structure of capitalism. In concert with the more formal mechanisms inside of it, and I'm going to conclude with this, so I won't keep rambling here. You have to have, in this society, structurally speaking, what's called cyclical consumption, and the more the better. The system has certain properties that are unviolatable, and if they were, it would change the system entirely. you wouldn't have what we call so-called capitalism if any of these properties were changed. Cyclical consumption means that in order to keep labor going, you have to have demand. In order to create demand, you have to have people getting money, which means they have to have labor, which means they have to have demand. So between producers and laborers and consumers, which were all kind of this unified in that way, but if you divide them into categories, everything has to constantly move, and the faster the better. We talk about economic growth in this society. It's not a contrivance. It's built directly into the structure of this system, and it's infinitely propelled, meaning that it's explicitly unsustainable. If there's any singular thing that I'll say about our economy, call it capitalism, call it market dynamics, whatever, it's that it is foundationally premised in an infinite growth paradigm. And you can't have that on a finite planet. It is literally impossible. It's what in system science you call a positive reinforcing feedback loop. And a positive reinforcing feedback loop always self-destructs. And since the 12,000 years, since the rise of technology, since population growth, and population growth isn't explicitly the problem, mind you. I'm not saying that we have to decrease population. That's actually the lowest of our priorities. It's the structural incentive that's the problem. We have come to this point of high technology, and we are right on the edge of complete catastrophe through ecological decline, socioeconomic inequality, and the development of destructive technology that we have no wisdom to control. The nuclear weapon was bad enough. Wait until artificial intelligence enters into the military establishment. And all of the other nanotechnology and extremely complex science that we've developed that we are not smart enough to understand and control. It's the wrong direction in terms of our wisdom because of all of this negativity, specifically the competitive nature of the planet as it is. So I'll stop right there. I hope that clarifies.
You talk about the market and you talk about the state. But there's a third aspect there, which I think is very key to what went wrong and very key to what we need in order to make things right, and that is human ethics. Mm-hmm. Adam Smith himself said there cannot be a free market system outside an ethical context. He himself said you can only do this in the context of human ethics. And even Milton Friedman said we're going to need a UBI for this to work. Otherwise, it would be a cruel system. So the fact that some people took the free market ethos and the free market system and applied it in very selfish, exploitative ways, there are others who would argue, and I'm really one of those, that if human ethics and reverence for the planet and reverence for each other were a central factor in all this, and if not only business was dominated by that kind of consciousness, but also regulations were dominated by that kind of consciousness, then we would have a different situation here. You just said that capitalism was inherently exploitative. I think there is such a thing as conscious capitalism. I think there is such a thing as as an employer saying, I'm going to pay you more because I don't know how you'll live on that.
Okay,
I don't think that the free market economy, in the hands of ethical people who are living their values that are beyond economic, then perhaps something could be different. As it is, not only is something not different, but for all the reasons that you said, and also when you were talking about infinite growth taking us to where we are, part of the problem is that we define infinite growth in terms of external growth. There are other kinds of infinite growth, the growth of wisdom, the growth of human creativity, greater art, greater literature, greater depths of education. But given your bottom line, and I do agree on the bottom line, which is that we're in for an apocalyptic, dystopian future closer than we even think if we don't get on top of this right now. What would you have us do?
Well, let me step back just to cover a few of those issues because I completely agree. I think we agree far more than we would ever disagree. I think in principle, in philosophical, moral, ethical principle, as the core of the axial age religions and the concept of morality puts forward in terms of trying to do unto others and all of that positivity. We've had a deep moral foundation that has been preached to us for literally thousands of years. And I guess the question first is, why hasn't that taken more root than it has already? And I simultaneously agree in principle broadly that if people did have an ethical sensibility in the deepest sense and were able to fight against the natural tendencies of the market system and the natural incentives of capitalism, yes, you could have a society that did not did not contribute to all of this imbalance and suffering and, brutality and exploitation through competition, dominance, and so forth. That is a theory that I think is best proven by the heroes of our society historically, such as the Martin Luther Kings, the Gandhis, Malcolm X's, and all of the civil rights and human rights leaders that have been out there that have preached to one degree or another the fact that we have to rise up against these forces. But that is not, unfortunately, where the average person rests in their spiritual, moral, and ethical discovery. That isn't convenient in the psychology of people because, unfortunately, the mental models that are forged by the incentives of our system are fundamentally based on a dominance, competitive, and exploitative ethic. So what you're battling against is a structure that you're trying to be morally, appropriate against. It doesn't reinforce the moral drive that's required, I think, to create the kind of sustainable consciousness that's out. It fights us. And I'll just say one more thing, because I know it looked like you wanted to say something. I think there's a necessity to have a certain humbleness with respect to the vulnerability we have as human beings in our cultural evolution, and to not see ourselves as so explicitly independent in this free will orientation. There's actually a great deal of argument to support the fact that we are so vulnerable to our conditions, to our upbringing, obviously, the culture that defines us. I mean, we ask ourselves the question, how much of you is you? Because if you really think about one's history or your own history, we all derive our sense of identity from some type of linkage to something else in the external, who we think we are, all of our identifications, our value systems, our religious beliefs, all of that comes from a cultural place on some level. So I argue a very complicated argument, and that if we humble ourselves and realize we are throughputs, realize we are vulnerable, realize that we can't necessarily outthink in terms of what's reinforced in the system, I think it's a very big stretch to assume that we're going to have a spiritual awakening inside of a completely toxic system. And unless that spiritual awakening allows us to change that system to stop all the negative reinforcements that continue to pollute the average individual. I'll just say one more thing. Most people think they're moral. Most people think they're ethical, but yet they still game. And I use that word literally. We are gaming in this system. The whole system is based on a zero-sum game. And we are game against each other for the sake of advantage, for the sake of literally trying to get more for the sake of our future at the expense of others one way or another. It's so slanted in that way, and provenly so. And I mean, you see my point. I find it challenging. And now I don't disagree that we have to have this kind of awakening to change the system. And that's exactly what I promote. That's why, you need to be shaming billionaires. You need to create a new sense of connection between people, a spiritual connection that says we have to create equality. We have to create equity. We have to find a way to do this to create balance, not just because it's the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, because if we don't, it doesn't work. The fourth major principle of sustainability that we've come to realize is equity. The more imbalance we create in this society, and I'm not referring to the ecological crisis, which will just reinforce the lack of equity. The imbalances that we've created psychologically are so catastrophic that they've led to long-term destabilizations that are going to be very, very difficult to fix the longer they go on, such as, say, the phenomenon of American mass shootings. Why is that specific to America? What is it about America that has created this bizarre, almost daily action of, 4 more people dying in a mass shooting? These are complicated subjects that I think root down to the social architecture. And we have to be vulnerable to that, as opposed to saying, oh, we can just outthink it. We just need more moral and ethical values. It all interplays, though, Marianne. I'm not contradicting what you're saying. I think there's more to it, and I think we have to have better system reinforcers to bring out the best of humanity, as opposed to what it's doing now, which I really believe is bringing out the worst of humanity.
Well, you said that you think most people think that they are ethical. I don't know if it's true that most people think that they are ethical, but I think most people deep in their hearts would like to be ethical. And there is such a thing as leadership. And the lack of ethical leadership has been a primary factor in taking us to where we are. If business leadership is not ethical, if political leadership is not ethical, if the issue of ethics and human character is not included in the way we educate our children at school, in the way that we raise our children, then literally all hell breaks loose, because there's such an an emotional and psychological chaos. There's a sense then that we don't owe anything to one another, the sense that we are not our brother's keeper, and therefore we become then we become vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely even psychotic forces, soulless forces, market forces that have no sense of human responsibility to other human beings or to animals or to the planet on which we live. But if you watch small children, we are born with a sense of yearning for one another and for fair play. I want to tell you a story about when my daughter was a really little girl. Interestingly enough, this was Arianna Huffington. Many people know Arianna. Arianna had a daughter who was exactly 1 year older than my daughter, and then there was another daughter. Arianna had another daughter exactly 1 year younger than my daughter. And one day the children were small. They were like 4, 5, 6, 3, 4, 5, something like that. And Ariana's youngest and mine were playing some kind of a child's board game. And I was explaining to Ariana's youngest daughter, you won. But to her, that meant that my daughter lost, and it was too horrifying for her. Her brain couldn't take in the good news that she won, because I said, look, you get all these pieces or whatever. And she went, no, in me here. And she kept trying to give them back, because where she was in her development, the idea that she might cause loss to another person override any excitement that I was trying to train her to experience, right? And I have seen this over and over and over again. This has to do with how people are taught. This is why I feel so strongly about front-ending resources into the direction of children, particularly small children. We need to build human compassion into the synapses of our brain development. 80% of the brain develops before the age of 5. And I believe that it's not just that we need to build in those synapses of compassion. I believe we need to foster those synapses of compassion that actually are there in the brain upon birth. And what happens, and that's why enlightenment is not a learning, enlightenment is an unlearning. So people are trained to hate. People are trained into the ways of exploitation. And then it is completely fostered. It is fostered by our educational system. It is fostered by so many of our human relationships and human dynamics. So I'm not saying, it's not as simple as saying we need a spiritual awakening, but it is a recognition that the ethical element deserves a lot more than but then there's that. It is as important a force as the market. It is as important a force as the state. And when it is lacking, then what is withdrawn from the human being is any kind of human responsibility or reverence or love for each other, for the planet, at which point we are at the beginning, where we already are, of a massive decline that could lead to the extinction of the species. I think you and I would agree on that.
I absolutely would, and I agree with everything you've just said. The conditioning that has occurred, that occurs in any lifespan, especially in the current structure, as I'll touch upon more so, takes that away, takes the compassion, takes the humanity. It extracts creativity as well out of children. We've regimented our educational system. It's based really about being cogs in the wheel of a system based on specialized labor and markets, a detachment, myopicness. People are very reductionist in their worldviews because we don't have a holistic sense of reality, because that's not the way we think in terms of the way we've organized society. University is a series of separate departments. It's not a unified whole, which it should be. And same goes for the way our economy is organized simultaneously. What I'll say in terms of the relativity of that, I'll give one example. Think about, as I've talked about just a moment ago, our society is powered by growth and consumption. Now, that's not a subjective decision. That's simply what the system is.
Absolutely correct.
So that is the structure. And this is what I'm trying to get at in terms of the problems inherent. Doesn't mean that everything isn't salvageable in the world that we see in terms of, as far as economics. It means that there are certain structural flaws. So if you have a system like that, where the more you push the gas pedal down on the car, the faster the economy goes, which means the more people consume and buy and consume and throw away. Oh, great, there's more jobs. You hear it on the news. Oh, GDP is rising. Look at what happened with COVID. 30% drop in GDP. What did everyone do? They just try to pump more money into the system to get GDP going again, meaning get more demand for jobs. And so the machine continues on its trajectory off the cliff. Think about resource exploitation. Now, we use the word exploitation in terms of human disregard. And again, that's kind of a vague definition and I'm not saying you meant it that way, but exploitation really is built into the system. And that's why a dead tree is more valuable than a living tree from the standpoint of the structure of the system. So you look at the enormous destructive, every life support system is currently in decline. You have elements of rainforests that are now producing more CO2 because of how disturbed the ecosystems have become. Obviously, all the topsoil, water pollution, it goes on and on. We've all heard this stuff in major lists. Why? Is it because we don't care? Are we really that dumb that we can't see that our habitat supports us? No, it's this myopic compartmentalization of behavior that has to do with the need to keep cyclical consumption and economic growth going. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is. Well, it matters when it's too late, because that's precisely what we're seeing. The only kind of a major dramatic shift in our economic and social behavior will likely happen, as it has historically through crises, when it's really too late. Because that's that's like the ultimate, what you call a balancing feedback loop. It's when the problems have become so severe that we can't even continue the distorted practices that we've put forward. So do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, of course. And that's that's what I fear in the Biden administration. Even where there's some good directions, it's too little, too slow, too late. That anything that we're doing that would make things better is on a level of it doesn't even begin to have the kind of urgency that is necessary. And as you would say, and I would totally agree with you, doesn't challenge the underlying assumptions of an economic order that is bound to take us back to the same problem that we had to begin with. So now I want to get back. You said a couple of minutes ago that it's not salvageable. First of all, do you think basically the survival of the human race, the trajectory moving forward, a sustainable trajectory, do you think that trajectory is salvageable? Do you think what do you think needs to be done, and how do you think we can do it?
Okay, well, when I say salvageable, I mean in terms of a systems view of what's happening, going not in the structure of capitalism as it's defined by classical economists, but in terms of what the system is, which is a system of labor specialization, which is important. We have to have people specialize in certain fields to some degree. We become part of a systemic unit network to get things done and create a good standard of living. And it takes a community to do that. That is what the network of markets has achieved, at least in the abstract of it. But there are other ways to do it. So you take that basic component of our community-driven efforts to improve life and keep things going, and then you start to break it down and realize what are the problematic attributes within what we've created. Markets, and this is the elephant in the living room, markets in the individual act of trade have built into them all of those negative structural attributes that I spoke of a moment ago in terms of unsustainability, both culturally and ecologically. We have to, as radical as this is, start to move away from the fundamental premise of market trade. I'm not saying it ceases to exist on all levels, because there are good arguments where on certain tiers it could, but we start to go a direction that really John Maynard Keynes in the mid-20th century started to talk about when we had the increase of efficiency during the Industrial Revolution. He had great foresight and great naivety, because he didn't understand the structural propensity to keep the system going regardless of how much efficiency we have. So let me clarify that. The idea was simple. You increase efficiency, people realize a sustainable standard of living based on scientific principles, you start to reduce the work week, you increase wages, you lower costs, all in direct proportion to itself based on the kind of technological, which is true, economic efficiency. And then suddenly you wake up one day and families have a unified form. No one's struggling to survive. No one's in debt. They have everything they need. They work a little bit a week, and suddenly balance emerges. Beautiful. That's not what the structure wants to do. The structure that we have is kind of like a sick demon. It's like an organism in and of itself. It has its own consciousness. And the moment anything Yeah, it's based upon fundamental deprivation. It's about,
It's
oh, you,
sociopathic. It's
it is.
soulless. That there's no compassion. It's sociopathic. But hold on,
Yeah.
I don't want to hear any more about how bad it is. We agree about how bad it is. We agree about its flaws. What I'm fascinated by are these ideas of what to do about it now.
Yeah.
So,
Well, getting,
but let's talk about this idea that you were just talking about. If people had more time, if people had more money, if people were relaxed, if balanced, a situation that would actually be conducive to a recalibration on the part of the universe and bringing harmony back in the system. Can you talk to me about what policies do you think could achieve this? So I'm going to name a few, and you tell me. UBI.
yes, in an incremental way.
Okay, what do you mean by that? UBI in an incremental way.
So UBI is really a way of compensating for the efficiency increases that are displacing labor. That was the fundamental premise of Andrew Yang's political ambitions. And it's been talked about for a long, long time. It's a way, instead of doing what John Maynard Keynes just suggested, that I just brought up, where you actually strategically demarketize, where people can live their lives without having to pay for everything, because we have the ability to generate abundance, even in the throes of the scarcity we're faced against. It's such a contrivance, what we've done problem-wise, we still have the ability to create an equitable abundance on this planet for everyone.
Buckminster Fuller.
Yes, and so UBI is a way of actually preserving the market system's fundamental negative intent by
just
not
trying to compensate for it.
Yeah, and not just pumping more money into the system, and that's I want to see alleviation of poverty. I want to see the socioeconomic tensions subside, and I think UBI would have a deep sociological and hence psychological effect. So that's what I mean by incremental, but I don't think it's a solution to anything.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, Medicare for all.
Of course. I think, unfortunately, though, Medicare for all, we sit in this country and we wonder why we can't do what the other European countries have done. And it's interesting from a system science standpoint over the course of history to ask yourself, what has happened in American culture and the American power system? It has to do with a lot of interfering factors that go back to colonialism and the evolution of this country and the deep entrenchment it has in the free market philosophy, which evolved in the neoliberal philosophy. And what you have is a global circumstance where the United States, not only its political leadership, but in many ways, much of the population, I'm not saying the majority, have been brainwashed into thinking that any kind of socialist anything, and that's not even the correct context, but that's the way people refer to it as, is somehow a failure of individual drive, or we haven't pulled up our bootstraps well enough, and we can't do that. We're going to be in gulags if we have Medicare for all.
Rugged individualism.
Yes, exactly. And I bring that up in terms of the global context because, Sanders, he's like very simple. It's almost boring. You want to impose the same fundamental things that we see in other countries that work. Why don't they work here? It's because there's a completely different neurotic culture and power establishment. It's a different angle of what has happened over the course of the past 100 years, especially after World War II. And I actually believe, Marianne, that you're going to have a really hard time ever getting the corporate funded government, the Congress, which is so in the back pockets of corporate America, the pharmaceutical industry, the massive medical industrial complex, to finally consent to Medicare for all, unless it serves their independent interests with the subsidies or whatever financial, kind of like the Obamacare thing. The insurance companies made out like a bandit because of how they finagled that to make it work out. So anyway, Medicare for all, obviously. Great.
So
let's see how it's going to happen.
What you were just referring to, of course, is that health insurance companies won't allow it. Big pharmaceutical companies won't allow it. And they have almost as much of a donor base inside the Democratic Party as inside the Republican Party. So then, just asking you on a very crass political level, do you therefore see people who are standing for more progressive values, the correction and radical transformation of capitalism so that it is no longer such a negative force on our planet as it has become? It's been weaponized against people for the sake of a very few people. Would you work to build up the progressive element of the Democratic Party that the Democratic establishment elite is seeking to suppress? Or would you, as a person interested in politics, go more in the direction of a third party?
That's a very good question. The problem with the third party is the duopoly of the left and right has become so powerful. Third party ambitions tend to be squandered. That's by force of the where the money goes in this system. I would actually probably say if you're going to use that angle, you go with the dominant institutions and you try to hijack them ultimately, ideally through progressives that come in to say the Democratic Party. But I have to admit, just broadly speaking, that I stand back from this as a kind of system science, in my system science lens. When you look at the Republicans and Democrats, and this isn't speaking of you, of course, it's speaking of the general establishment as it existed, because you are an outlier, and thankfully so, you really have only a conservative party. There's not a progressive party or a progressive element really within the Democratic establishment. They all support the fundamental foundation of our system.
Corporatist agenda.
Yeah, and that is, unfortunately, as I said before, a structural reality. It is a social psychology built upon the dark incentives, the unfortunate incentives of what market capitalism has done to our culture and how it functions. So I step way back and I say we need a completely different approach. We don't sideline political interests and activism. I completely commend what you're doing to bring good people to the forefront, and I commend all those that have given their attempts. But there is such capture of the government by business, and necessarily so, meaning it's the government of our society is literally an outcome of the economic structure. That's why it's even formulated that way in hierarchy. That's why we have a president. That's why lobbying is legal. That's why the business infrastructure, which makes everything work, is entrenched. I mean, if you think about it, it's inconsistent for government to not be utterly influenced by business interests because money buys everything. And we think we're going to draw a line at politicians and political policy. We all know that lobbyists write so many of the laws because that's just what the system has become. And we look the other way. We say, well, that's corruption. That's not the way it's supposed to be. We can fix that if we get better people in there. And then year after year, the same kind of patterns.
No, I don't think people think that at all. People realize that it was the Supreme Court in the 1970s, those decisions beginning with the declaration on their part that money is free speech, climaxing with the Citizens United decision that gave complete unlimited power to corporations to unduly influence our elections. Listen, it was a Supreme Court Justice, the late Louis Brandeis, who said you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. So this all has to do with who's on your Supreme Court. I mean, this you say it was built into the system, but it's built into a particular consciousness about how the system should operate. And if members of the Supreme Court had been different, if some of the decisions on the part of the Supreme Court had been different, when you look at something like the New Deal, you look at something like the financial regulations that were instituted during that time, he pushed back against what he called the economic royalists. So the history of the United States has not been one long hegemonic story of capitalist horror. It has been a continuing trend towards hegemonic capitalist horror, met at various times by extraordinary pushback. Extraordinary pushback such as unions, extraordinary pushback such as child labor laws, extraordinary pushback such as the New Deal. Extraordinary pushback such as the civil rights movement, extraordinary pushback such as the women's rights movement. So I think that you paint a picture that does not allow for human agency and the ability of human agency to push back against a monster. I mean, this is a spiritual contest. This really is the forces of freedom against this soulless, demonic force that you describe so well. So, that's where you and I,
sure.
It's interesting. We sit perched. I think you and I would agree. It's either going to get really, 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 really bad, or this is going to be a miracle, basically. And there's going to be some kind of fundamental breakthrough that I just feel if you look at American history, we've had some of those. And I think we could have one now.
I completely agree with you. However, if you look at all of the major pushbacks, as you put it, which first of all, think about your language, the pushback, it implies that there is a current that we're trying to move against. I often use the analogy of the river. Yes, and that current, unfortunately, is going to continue its force, regardless of how we push back to some degree. FDR, yeah.
And until we are an enlightened species, that will be true.
Okay, and I would counter that, and I agree with you, by the way. I would counter that, in specifics to say until we have a system that reinforces the better sides of our nature, that reinforces our better angels, this system doesn't do that. The river is flowing the direction that we are moving against in all the movements, all the civil rights movements, all the seeming revolutions. All of them are being eroded slowly over time by that river, even though they have held their place for some time. FDR has been under attack for so long in his policies. They've been trying to remove all of those social safety. And that tells you something about the fundamental path and ethic of the dominant culture in the system, which I argue is not necessarily a pollution of the mind per se individually in the sense of a kind of awakening that's required and it's all about the individual mind. I agree that's part of it, but until we have a reinforcing social system that actually promotes human rights, where it's built into the way we think as opposed to exploitation, dominance, and competition, I think we're in a lot of trouble.
Okay, so are you thinking that socialism would be that system?
No, I don't agree with any. What do you think
would be that system?
So again, going back to the principles of sustainability and public health, and through that lens, I throw out all the isms. It doesn't matter. You look at what's going to work from the most principled standpoint based on the knowledge we have today in terms of understanding human behavior and understanding what's required to live on the planet. And even more interestingly in that, because you have a lot of people out there, and I'm sure you've heard it, oh, it's just human nature to be competitive. Oh, it's just human nature to want more and be greedy, and all that false, silly mythology that stands to hold up this system is really what it is. It's propaganda to try and preserve the establishment and the structure that's behind it. Instead, what you find is that, the fundamental principles of epidemiology rest on the ecological crisis. We have to be sustainable on the planet, which precedes everything. It doesn't matter what our human nature is. I don't believe evolution has designed us to self-destruct. In evolution or whatever organization of nature that has put us on this planet and made us set in motion, we are not designed like any other species to self-destruct. We're generating this behavior, meaning that what we think we are, what we think we're doing is irrelevant to what we need to do based on principles of science to become sustainable. If we do not have a steady state economy, if we do not have an economy based on equilibrium and remove the growth element that's built into the structure, then it doesn't matter what else we do otherwise, because we're going to continue the negative ecological trajectory. So let's start from right there. How do we create a steady state economy? Is capitalism, as we call it, capable of doing that? Not by any principles I can see. So that's one kernel seed, steady state. Then you look at the principles of public health. We need equity. We need equality. 99% of human history, we were in hunter-gatherer societies in egalitarian, non-hierarchical structures. We are an anomalous period, in fact, in human society. It's a complete anomaly that we have the economy we do and that we're behaving in the hierarchical, power-dominated, unsustainable methods that we are. It really is. I mean, people think that this is just the way it is and humans have always been this way. No. You go to indigenous cultures, completely different ethics, very non-hierarchical once again. All of the traditional forms that we see that are codified in our current world that people think is human nature, completely destroyed by the indigenous cultures, hunter-gatherer cultures specifically that were studied in the 20th century by people like Margaret Mead and many other anthropologists. Equity is what you find in those societies. They don't have wars. Simply look at the Mennonites and the Amish and all of these other kind of derivatives of deep Orthodox religion. They don't even have violence. They haven't had murders in like centuries. So you need equity as the fundamental foundation. And you can't have a society that's based upon division hierarchy as this structure unfortunately creates. So I'll stop right there just so we can continue. You need ecological balance, steady state. You need equity. And how do we get a system to do that? And it's bigger than, just wanting to be more ethical about it. The structure moves against both of those forces.
So in our country, we have personal freedom to the point of personal license, but at the expense of equity, at the expense of an economic system that allows for the kind of equity that you say. to me, what the American system does, the American system of government as it was initially instituted, is that it leaves it to free will. It leaves us to us. That's why, as long as our democracy itself is so unduly influenced and at this point practically controlled by these economic forces, that's why we have such a problem. Because people don't recognize, people have been brainwashed, as you said, people have been propagandized, so that people are constantly voting against their own best interests, both economically, etc. And it all goes back to ethical leadership. And this is why, I fear, based on everything that you said, that if we don't get this right, then what we're going to have is like an environmental dictator. We are going to either have a neo-fascist dystopian era lying in front of us, or we're going to have such a moral and ethical awakening combined with such a democratic, a real pro-democracy movement in this country. It seems to me those are the only two choices, Peter. It doesn't seem to me, everything that you said, you're right. We can't continue the way we are. It is unsustainable.
Right. Just to comment on your anticipation of the future, I just want to reiterate a little bit on or expand upon one structural phenomenon in terms of how we think about business. Business is a dictatorship. Business, in its formal construct, as it's practiced across the world, is a fascist institution. It has nothing to do with democracy. And so why would we expect our governments to not employ the same kind of top-down? I mean, look at Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the archetype. He is almost a child of the socioeconomic order that we have.
He was subconsciously, once we started making the businessman God, once that happened, then it was almost inevitable that this gross perversion of what a businessman is would become this dictator type character that you were mentioning. But when I was growing up, Peter, the difference between now and when I was growing up was that there was a sense, when I was young, that the government was more powerful than the CEOs. Today, it's become inverted, and it's so clear that the CEOs dictate to the government. And that's why, once again, until we get our democracy back, that's where that emergence, the revolution, the resurrection has got to come from a sense that people, I do still agree with Thomas Jefferson that the only safe repository for power in the United States is in the hands of the people. But once again, as you said yourself, the people have been so propagandized, the people have been so brainwashed, and now those same forces, in fear, because they're fearing now that the people are starting to wake up. That's why you have all these voter suppression laws, and now even these voter nullification laws, because they do realize that an awakening is at hand. And
yes.
I want to thank you for being one of the great awakeners. I've learned so much from you. So many people have learned so much from you, Peter. And
thank you. Likewise. I appreciate you having me on.
Contributor.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anything else specific that you want to add before we close? You've been very generous with your time.
Well, it's an enormous conversation. Going back just briefly to your question about what to do, this is something that's being thought about not in the realm not in the political arena, but in the social science and system science arena. I think what's going to happen to change the society is you're going to see people start to get off the grid of the market economy through community-driven but yet high-tech networking that allows a new kind of industry, a peer-to-peer industry, a move towards open source and automation and access versus property. We see kernels of this. And I talk about this towards the end of my book, The New Human Rights Movement. There is a transition plan. And as I said before, it moves away from markets as far as possible because my fundamental thesis, and I really believe it, and we can talk more about this another time, it doesn't override any of the other attempts. We have to have ethical, positive, political leadership and general leadership, whether political or not. We need forefront people to change the cultural dynamic, to start to move away from the sickness that this society and ultimately its structure, its underlying economic structure is creating. And I think there's a process to do that, which has to do with slowly demarketizing. And if anyone wants to check that out, they can read my book, The New Human Rights Movement, towards the end. And I've given a lot of talks on that, and I'm about to have an upcoming lecture which will go into that in more detail in terms of actual design initiatives.
Your book is great.
Thanks.
The plan is fascinating. The time element is what's so scary to me, because this is
Sure.
the conversation we should have been having 40 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
And as you said, use the word gradually or use the word slowly. This is not something that can happen quickly.
I know.
On the other hand, as the Course in Miracles says, miracles collapse time. The more deeply we understand an issue, the more quickly we can make the change.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm grateful that you were here, and I hope that this is one of many conversations that we'll be having pretty much for the rest of our lives. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Marianne. Take care.
Much love.